The candles had burned low in the private chambers of Windsor Castle on that December night in 1861, their flickering light casting grotesque shadows across the ornate wallpaper. Queen Victoria knelt beside the mahogany bed where her beloved Albert lay dying, his breathing shallow and laboured, each ragged gasp tearing through her chest like a physical wound. The physicians had withdrawn to the corners of the room, their faces grave, their uselessness apparent. Outside, the winter wind howled through the ancient stone corridors, but inside, time itself seemed to slow, stretching each terrible moment into an eternity. Victoria clutched her husband's hand, feeling the warmth slowly leaving his fingers. And in that instant, the most powerful woman in the world, ruler of the greatest empire the planet had ever known, was utterly, devastatingly powerless. She pressed her lips to his fevered brow and whispered promises she knew she could not keep, begging him not to leave her alone in a world she could not bear to face without him. When Albert's final breath rattled from his chest at 10:50 that night, something inside Victoria died with him, and the woman who would define an entire era was forever transformed by grief into someone the world had never seen before. The death of Prince Albert marked not just a personal tragedy, but a pivotal moment that would reshape the British monarchy and cast a shadow over the remaining 40 years of Victoria's reign. But to understand the depth of that loss, we must journey back to the beginning, to the unlikely story of a young princess who never expected to wear the crown, and who built a life behind palace walls far more complex, passionate, and human than history often remembers. Before we continue deeper into Victoria's extraordinary story, I want to take a moment to speak with you directly. If you're finding value in these detailed historical narratives, if these glimpses into the real lives behind the crowns and thrones speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows us to continue exploring the hidden corners of history together. It means more than you know to have you as part of this community of history enthusiasts. Now, let us return to the world of Victorian Britain and uncover the private life of its most famous monarch. Alexandrina Victoria was born at Kensington Palace on May 24, 1819, into circumstances that seemed designed to keep her far from the throne. She was the only legitimate child of the Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III, and her arrival was met with neither fanfare nor particular celebration. The Georgian court was a place of scandal and excess, where her uncles lived lives of such debauchery that they became bywords for moral corruption. Her father died when she was merely 8 months old, leaving Victoria and her German-born mother, the Duchess of Kent, dependent on the charity of the royal family and living in increasingly shabby apartments within Kensington Palace. The young princess grew up under what became known as the Kensington system, a suffocating regime designed by her mother and the ambitious courtier Sir John Conroy to keep Victoria isolated, dependent, and controllable. She was never allowed to be alone. She slept in her mother's bedroom until the day she became queen. She was forbidden from meeting people without supervision, denied the company of children her own age, and subjected to endless lessons designed to prepare her for a role that seemed, at best, a distant possibility. Conroy, a manipulative figure who may have been the Duchess's lover, clearly intended to become the power behind the throne when Victoria ascended, treating the young princess with a mixture of bullying, condescension, and barely concealed contempt. But Victoria was made of sterner stuff than they imagined. Her journals, which she kept faithfully from the age of 13, reveal a girl of remarkable intelligence, keen observation, and stubborn willfulness. She recorded everything: the weather, her lessons, the music she heard, the books she read, her impressions of people and places. Even in these early entries, we see the sharp mind that would later guide an empire. She was acutely aware of being manipulated, of being kept like a prisoner in her own home, and she quietly nurtured a core of steel that would serve her well. The princess was small, barely 5 feet tall even as an adult, with prominent blue eyes that could flash with temper or soften with sentiment. She had the Hanoverian family's tendency toward plumpness, something that would increase dramatically after childbearing. Her voice, contemporaries noted, was surprisingly strong and clear for someone of her stature. She loved music, particularly opera, and had a genuine talent for drawing and painting, producing hundreds of accomplished watercolors throughout her life. She adored her dogs, particularly her spaniel Dash, who provided companionship during her lonely childhood. And she had a temper, oh what a temper, that could erupt with volcanic force when provoked. On the morning of June 20th, 1837, Victoria was awakened at 6 o'clock at Kensington Palace by her mother, who told her that the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain wished to see her. The 18-year-old princess threw a dressing gown over her nightclothes and descended to meet them. They knelt before her and informed her that her uncle, King William IV, had died in the early hours of the morning, and that she was now queen. Victoria's response was characteristically composed and revealing. She asked to be left alone for an hour. In that private moment, the first she had been permitted in her entire life, she steeled herself for the role ahead. Her first act as queen was to demand her own bedroom. For the first time in 18 years, she would sleep alone, free from her mother's suffocating supervision. She moved her mother's apartments to a distant corner of Buckingham Palace and kept her at arm's length. Sir John Conroy was banished from court, his schemes in ruins. The girl who had been kept deliberately weak and dependent revealed herself to be decisive, confident, and fully capable of wielding power. Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister, became a surrogate father figure, and the young Queen threw herself into her duties with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. But Victoria was lonely. The isolation of her childhood had left her starving for affection and companionship. She was the most powerful person in Britain, perhaps in the world, yet she ate her meals alone and spent her evenings with only her ladies-in-waiting for company. The court was formal, rigid, bound by protocols that seemed designed to keep the monarch separate from genuine human connection. She was young, passionate, and deeply romantic, fed on a diet of novels and opera, and she longed for something more than the cold grandeur of her position. Enter Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria had met her cousin briefly when she was 16, but when he visited England in October 1839, she saw him with new eyes. Albert was handsome, devastatingly so, with a classical profile, deep blue eyes, and a serious demeanour that appealed to Victoria's romantic sensibilities. But he was also intelligent, cultured, passionate about music and art, and possessed of high moral seriousness that set him apart from the dissolute English aristocracy. Within days of his arrival, Victoria was desperately in love. Being queen meant that Victoria had to propose to Albert herself, a reversal of convention that she accomplished with characteristic directness. On October 15th, 1839, she summoned him to her room and informed him that it would make me too happy if he would consent to what I wished. Albert's response was everything she could have hoped for. They married on February 10th, 1840, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, and Victoria discovered that being in love was even more wonderful than she had imagined. The early years of Victoria and Albert's marriage were marked by a passionate physical relationship that shocked and delighted the Queen. Her journal entries and letters to Albert are remarkably frank for the Victorian era, revealing a woman who delighted in her husband's body and was unashamed of her desire. She loved being pregnant less. She referred to childbearing as the shadow side of marriage and described babies as frog-like and rather disgusting. But she and Albert nevertheless produced 9 children over 17 years. Each pregnancy was difficult, marked by her famous temper and periods of what we would now recognize as depression. But Albert remained devoted, patient with her moods, and increasingly indispensable to both her personal happiness and her role as monarch. What the public never fully understood was how completely Albert transformed Victoria's reign. Initially resented by the British establishment as a foreign interloper with no official role, Albert gradually became Victoria's private secretary, her closest advisor, and effectively her co-ruler. He reorganized the royal household, turning it from a corrupt and inefficient establishment into a model of Germanic efficiency. He involved himself in social causes, from workers' housing to the abolition of slavery. He championed education, the arts, and scientific progress. His greatest achievement was the Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the magnificent Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, which showcased Britain's industrial might and attracted 6 million visitors. But Albert's influence on Victoria was even more profound in private. He tempered her impulsiveness with careful consideration. He helped her navigate complex political situations with tact and intelligence. He gave her a vision of constitutional monarchy that balanced influence with restraint. And he provided her with a domestic ideal, a loving marriage, a growing family, a private life that stood in stark contrast to the debauchery of her predecessors. The Victorian ideal of respectability, of the sacred family unit, of moral earnestness combined with material progress, all of this reflected Albert and Victoria's private life as much as any broader social movement. Their retreats at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and Balmoral Castle in Scotland were attempts to create spaces where they could live as a normal family, away from the oppressive formality of court. At Osborne, designed by Albert himself in the style of an Italian villa, the royal children played on the beach and learned to garden. At Balmoral, purchased by Albert in 1852, they walked the Highland Hills, attended local gatherings, and embraced Scottish culture with an enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on the absurd. Albert wore kilts and played the bagpipes. Victoria learned to dance Scottish reels. They were, as much as was possible for a reigning monarch and her prince consort, trying to live ordinary lives. But ordinary was never quite achievable. The demands of monarchy were relentless. There were constant political crises, from conflicts with Parliament to foreign policy challenges. There were social problems that seemed insurmountable. The desperate poverty of industrial cities, where workers lived in conditions of almost unimaginable squalor, where children labored in mines and factories, where disease and early death were commonplace. Victoria and Albert were not indifferent to these problems. Albert, in particular, was deeply engaged with social reform, and Victoria supported numerous charitable causes. But they were also products of their time, believing in social hierarchy, in the natural order of things, in noblesse oblige, rather than fundamental structural change. The Queen's private life was also marked by her relationships with her children, which were often difficult and fraught with tension. Victoria was not a naturally maternal woman. She found young children tiresome and was frequently exasperated by the demands of motherhood. Her eldest daughter, also named Victoria, bore the brunt of her mother's perfectionism and disappointment. The Princess Royal was brilliant, strong-willed, and eventually married to the Crown Prince of Prussia. But her relationship with her mother was marked by constant criticism and control. The Prince of Wales, Bertie, who would eventually become Edward VII, was a particular source of frustration. Victoria and Albert subjected him to a punishing educational regime designed to mould him into a model constitutional monarch. But Bertie proved resistant to their plans, preferring pleasure to duty, society to scholarship. The royal household behind closed doors was a curious mixture of formality and intimacy. Servants were everywhere, observing, listening, gossiping. Nothing was truly private. Victoria's every movement was attended, her meals prepared and served by a small army of staff, her clothes laid out by her dresser. Even in private moments with Albert, they were never truly alone. There were always servants in adjoining rooms, always ladies in waiting within call. The price of royalty was the almost complete absence of privacy, something that weighed heavily on Victoria throughout her life. Albert's death in 1861 shattered Victoria's world completely. He had been suffering from chronic stomach problems for years, likely the result of Crohn's disease or stomach cancer, though the final diagnosis was typhoid fever. Victoria watched helplessly as he deteriorated over 2 weeks, his characteristic vigor draining away until he was barely conscious. When he died, Victoria's grief was immediate, all-consuming and transformative. She cut off her hair and placed it in his hands in the coffin. She ordered his rooms at Windsor preserved exactly as they had been at the moment of his death. His clothes laid out, his papers on his desk, fresh flowers placed daily. She wore black mourning clothes for the remaining 40 years of her life, refusing to appear in public for years and earning the nickname the Widow of Windsor. What followed was perhaps the most controversial period of Victoria's reign. She effectively withdrew from public life, refusing to perform ceremonial duties, declining to open Parliament, avoiding London whenever possible. The British public, initially sympathetic, grew increasingly impatient with their invisible monarch. Republican sentiment grew, particularly among the working classes who saw little value in a queen who did nothing but mourn. There were calls for her abdication, questions about whether the monarchy would survive. Victoria didn't seem to care. She was drowning in grief, suffering from what was almost certainly severe depression, and could barely function. But she continued to work. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period. While Victoria couldn't face public ceremonies, she continued to read every government dispatch, to correspond with her ministers, to involve herself in policy decisions. She worked from her private rooms, dressed in black, surrounded by images and mementos of Albert, continuing to rule even as she retreated from view. Her influence over government was, if anything, stronger during this period, precisely because she was so isolated and focused on paperwork rather than public spectacle. It was during this period that Victoria formed the most controversial relationship of her life, one that has fascinated historians and scandalmongers ever since. John Brown was a Scottish servant at Balmoral, a gruff Highlander who had been Albert's personal gillie, and who treated the Queen with a rough familiarity that would have been unthinkable from anyone else. After Albert's death, Brown became Victoria's constant companion, riding out with her, attending her, speaking to her with an informality that shocked the court. Rumours flew that they had secretly married, that Brown was her lover, that she had lost her mind and fallen under the spell of a common servant. The truth was almost certainly more innocent, but also more revealing. Victoria, in her grief, needed someone who would treat her as a person rather than a queen, who would scold her when she was unreasonable, who would force her to go outside and ride when she wanted to stay in her rooms. Brown fulfilled that role with rough devotion. He protected her, literally and figuratively. When a deranged man attacked her carriage in 1872, Brown subdued him. When she was drowning in despair, he bullied her into living. Their relationship was probably not sexual. Victoria was too conventional, too bound by her sense of propriety. But it was deeply emotional, a lifeline for a woman who felt she had nothing left to live for. As the years passed, Victoria gradually emerged from her seclusion, driven partly by political necessity and partly by the realization that the monarchy's survival depended on public visibility. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887, celebrating 50 years on the throne, was a magnificent spectacle that reaffirmed the monarchy's place in British life. By then, she was an old woman, increasingly stout, moving with difficulty, but also a living symbol of stability and continuity. She had outlasted most of her ministers, had watched the world transform around her, and had become, in a sense, Britain itself, flawed, often difficult, but enduring. Victoria's relationships with her adult children and their families became the consuming focus of her later years. She was the grandmother of Europe, her descendants occupying thrones across the continent. This network of family connections was meant to ensure peace, but it would ultimately fail spectacularly when her grandchildren went to war against each other in 1914. Victoria herself became increasingly autocratic, demanding absolute obedience from her family, interfering in their marriages and child-rearing, and reacting with fury when crossed. She feuded with Bertie, who waited decades to become king, living a life of pleasure that appalled his mother. She doted on her youngest child, Beatrice, refusing to let her marry for years, and then only on condition that she remain living with her mother. Behind the public image of the respectable Victorian matriarch was a woman of passionate opinions and surprising prejudices. She was a fierce conservative in later life, appalled by the growing democratization of Britain. She opposed women's suffrage, considering the women's rights movement dangerous nonsense. She had complicated views on race and empire, capable of genuine affection for her Indian servants while supporting policies of imperial domination. She could be petty, holding grudges for decades. She could be generous, remembering the birthdays of servants' children and intervening personally to help people in distress. She was, in short, human, flawed, contradictory, capable of great love and great stubbornness in equal measure. The private papers Victoria left behind, her journals, her letters, her memoranda, reveal a woman far more complex than the stern matriarch of popular imagination. She wrote constantly, producing an estimated 60 million words over her lifetime. Her journals alone filled 141 volumes. She wrote to her children daily, offering advice, criticism, and affection in exhausting detail. She corresponded with her prime ministers, her relatives, her friends, leaving a paper trail that provides an unparalleled insight into her mind and emotions. After her death, her youngest daughter Beatrice was tasked with editing the journals, and she destroyed huge portions, particularly anything relating to John Brown or that she deemed too intimate or controversial. What survived was still enough to fill multiple volumes. Victoria's health declined gradually in her final years. She suffered from rheumatism, had difficulty walking, and eventually needed a wheelchair. Her eyesight failed, but her mind remained sharp, and she continued to work almost until the end. She dictated letters, received ministers, and maintained her interest in affairs of state. She knew she was dying by January 1901, and she faced death with characteristic determination. She gave detailed instructions for her funeral, insisting on a military rather than a state funeral, demanding that she be buried in white rather than black, and specifying that Albert's dressing gown and a cast of his hand be placed in her coffin alongside photographs of John Brown. Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on January 22, 1901, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She had reigned for 63 years and 7 months, longer than any British monarch before her. The nation mourned genuinely, recognizing that an era had truly ended. The Victorian age, with all its contradictions, its prosperity and poverty, its progress and prejudice, its respectability and hypocrisy, was finished. But Victoria's influence extended far beyond her lifetime. She transformed the British monarchy from a corrupt and outdated institution into something modern and respected. She and Albert created the template for royal family life that persists to this day. The image of the monarch as a family person, living a respectable domestic life, serving as a moral example to the nation. This was pure invention, a conscious creation designed to rehabilitate a damaged institution, but it worked so well that it became reality. Victoria's private life, her passionate marriage, her devastating grief, her complicated relationships with her children, her unlikely friendship with John Brown, humanized the monarchy in ways that were both politically necessary and emotionally genuine. She was not just a queen, but a woman, subject to the same loves and losses, joys and sorrows as her subjects. This was revolutionary. Previous monarchs had been distant figures, either debauched or remote. Victoria was neither. She was respectable but relatable, powerful but vulnerable. The Victoria who emerges from historical records is not the stern, unsmiling figure of popular caricature. That image comes mainly from photographs taken in her later years when exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still, making smiles impossible. The real Victoria laughed, cried, raged, loved, and grieved with an intensity that was exhausting to those around her. She was capable of genuine warmth and crushing coldness, sometimes in the same conversation. She was deeply romantic while also being practical and shrewd. She was a devoted wife and mother who was also often a difficult and demanding partner and parent. Understanding Victoria's private life helps us understand the Victorian era itself. The age took its character not just from economic and social forces, but from the personality and preferences of the woman who gave it her name. The emphasis on family life, on respectability, on moral earnestness combined with material progress. These reflected Victoria's own values and her partnership with Albert. The rigid social hierarchies, the resistance to change, the combination of genuine charitable concern with fundamental conservatism. These too reflected the Queen's worldview. But Victoria was also a product of her era, shaped by forces larger than any individual. She was a constitutional monarch operating within increasingly democratic constraints. She was a woman wielding power in a profoundly patriarchal society, navigating complex limitations on what she could do and how she could do it. She was a widow who transformed personal tragedy into political resilience, discovering that grief could coexist with duty, that it was possible to continue functioning even when it seemed impossible. The rooms at Windsor Castle that Victoria ordered preserved after Albert's death were maintained for decades after her own passing, a shrine to a love that had defined her life and shaped an empire. They stand now as a monument to a marriage that was genuine and deep, whatever its complexities and challenges. Victoria's grief was not just performance or sentiment. It was the real agony of a woman who had found in Albert something she had been searching for her entire lonely childhood: unconditional love, intellectual partnership, and genuine companionship. As we look back across more than a century at Victoria's life, what emerges is a portrait of someone trying to balance public duty with private desire, trying to be both a person and a symbol, trying to maintain humanity while occupying an inherently inhuman position. She succeeded more often than she failed, though not without cost. The price of her devotion to duty was often her own happiness, and that of those closest to her. The price of her grief was years of isolation that damaged both her and the institution she represented. The price of her power was the constant surveillance, the absence of privacy, the knowledge that her every action would be scrutinized and judged. Yet Victoria persevered. She faced tragedy and continued ruling. She navigated political crises and personal losses. She watched the world change in ways that must have seemed bewildering. From gas lamps to electric lights, from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, from a world of empires to the first stirrings of modern democracy. She adapted or resisted as her nature dictated, but she endured. The woman who died in 1901 had lived through the entire century, had shaped it profoundly, and had left an indelible mark on the world. She had transformed the British monarchy, influenced politics and society in ways both obvious and subtle, and created a family network that would shape Europe for generations. But perhaps her most important legacy was proving that it was possible to be both powerful and human, to wield authority while remaining vulnerable, to be a symbol while maintaining an inner life that was rich, complex, and real. Behind the crown, behind the black mourning clothes and the stern public image, Victoria was a woman of fierce passions and deep emotions, capable of great love and great stubbornness, flawed and human and utterly herself. Understanding her private life doesn't diminish her historical importance. It enhances it, revealing the human reality behind the icon, the woman behind the queen, the person behind the legend. And in that revelation, we find not just history, but humanity. Not just facts, but truth. Not just a monarch, but a life fully lived in all its complexity and contradiction.